Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Devine, and I'm the practice leader for the HR consulting group at Univest Insurance. Very happy to be with you all today. This is a great topic, and I really enjoyed the research process, and some of the findings are pretty interesting. So I'm looking forward to being with you all for about the next hour. We may run a little bit over. There's just a lot of content here. We do have a lot of folks joining us. We're somewhere near 150 at this point, but there were over 200 that responded. So I am going to save questions for the end, but please feel free through the chat function to ask questions. And at the end of the presentation, we'll get to as many as we can. If we're going over time and folks have to jump off, completely understood. But anyway, I am very pleased to be presenting this topic of why COVID-19 is such a game changer for employers. And we have a couple of my colleagues from the leadership team here at Univest, Greg Blemlek and Reggie Reiter. Greg is the Senior Vice President, Employee Benefits Practice Leader, and he's going to talk about some COVID-19 related trends in employee benefits. And then Reggie Reiter is also Senior VP. He's our Commercial Lines Team Leader. And Reggie's going to talk about the viability of COVID-19 related workers' compensation claims. And overall, our three groups plus our support teams, we make up Univest Insurance, which, as many of you may know, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Univest Bank and Univest Financial Corporation. We're going to be presenting these topics in the future, things that are timely, things that have topics that have maybe are in the news, but also have great relevance for employers and the companies in our client base and throughout the region. And I wanted to just make sure to put this right up front. The next one in the series is on Wednesday, October 14th at 1 p.m. And it's the business insurance implications of COVID-19, and that will be hosted by Reggie. So please mark your calendar, and if you can join us, we'd love to have you. The next thing I wanted to do is just go through the session and what we're going to cover today. As I said, there's a lot of content, but we'll try and get through all of it. There are some changes that I'm sure you've seen some of them in the news and some of the higher profile companies. And so we're going to talk through some of those changes in U.S. workplaces. Then there are some findings from recent surveys about how things are going in the remote work environment and what's happening with employee engagement. The litigation landscape is really, I don't think if I said it's exploding, it would be an overstatement. It's really, things are really growing. I have some statistics to share with you and examples of some cases and where some of the trends are leaning. But we'll also cover how we might, as companies and employers, mitigate that risk, particularly as it relates to employee relations issues. Then Greg will jump on and talk about the impact of COVID-19 on employee benefits plans. Reggie will cover business insurance implications and availability, particularly with regard to workers' compensation. And then I'll provide a bit of a compliance update on COVID-19 legislation and guidelines. There's not a lot there in terms of the update, but there are some things that could be helpful, and particularly in some of the guidance for smaller employers that the CDC has put out. This is an important reminder. We are a financial institution. Just need to share this with everyone. Bottom line here is that we make every effort to make sure that the information we're sharing with everyone is accurate, but it's not intended as legal advice or financial advice, and we strongly urge that if you are going to take some of this information that we share with you today and act upon it, that you seek guidance from counsel before you do so. There are also some content here that is the content owners have given their express permission for us to use some of the content. And I want to make sure that that's made clear up front. So content owners, we've reached out to them and gotten their permission in writing. So wherever you see some of that, I'll share the reference with you at the bottom of the screen. Okay, now that we've taken care of some of that, let's get into some of the information that I want to share with you today. I think we probably all heard about what companies like Google, maybe Facebook are doing with respect to their workplaces. And it's one of those things where if you look at some of the other companies, there is kind of a variety of I guess, changes that are being planned. But if you look at those bottom two, and also Ancestry towards the top, they're saying that they're going to have options to work from home permanently. Others have sort of a sunset provision on the work from home, and they're making statements regarding the date they're going to have employees come back to the workplace. But my guess is they're going to play kind of a wait and see game there and make sure that, like in one case, I believe it's Netflix, they're going to work from home till the vaccine is available. That may be something that other companies follow suit on. But I thought this was interesting because some of these companies have just massive footprints in their facilities, large investments in square footage. Microsoft, for example, I was out in the Seattle area a couple of years ago, and the office where I visited was in this complex, and there were several numbered offices, maybe, and they're 3-4 stories high, maybe in the 75,000 to 100,000 square foot range, and they were all numbered, and there were 50 or 60 of them. And I asked who I was visiting. I said, who are those offices? Who do they belong to? And they said, oh, that's all Microsoft. So there's a large tower in downtown Seattle, but then Microsoft also has a huge footprint out in the suburbs. So it's hard to understand how a company like that would have everyone working from home permanently when they've made such an investment. And their CEO is starting to sort of posture about that by saying that he misses walking into that physical meeting, talking to the person next to you, and connecting with them, on a more personal level for maybe a couple minutes after the meeting is over. So I would say that Microsoft is probably going to return their folks to the office, but it still remains to be seen. So factors influencing flexibility. One of the things that's really important to remember is that companies might choose longer work from home arrangements because they can. Their business model is conducive to flexible work arrangements. Certainly if you are, say, a machine shop, a manufacturing facility, chemical plant, anything where workers need to be on site, obviously that's not going to work. But any of us out there who are in office environments, if you can have employees working from home, it's probably something under more permanent consideration. In order to do that, the companies that I think are early adopters of this recognize that they have a strong leadership culture, and their managers are able to work with remote teams. And this is easier said than done. It's something that really has to be taken into strong consideration because there may be managers out there, and some of us may feel like they're more of a kind of walk around, check on people, make sure they're at their desk, sort of high touch. It's just not available. And managing a remote team myself, I could say that there's an element of trust that just has to be there all the time, and at a comfort level that people are doing their jobs, and it doesn't matter whether they're in front of you or remote. Some companies are looking at this as a way to leverage things and say, we have this big real estate footprint. Maybe it's time to take a look at that and be more efficient. If we can spend the money elsewhere and spend it on our customers or spend it on marketing and growing our market position, maybe we ought to consider doing that. There's also a big fear factor around safety, and I have to say that this is something that's very real, and as employers, we all have this duty now to make sure that when we mandate that employees are coming back to their workplace, our workplace is clean and it's safe. It's something that in, say, a non-toxic environment, like a chemical environment, if you're not in that type of environment in the past, and just an office, you may never even have thought about it. You know, how many of us have thought about the cleaning service that our office, either a shared space or a space that we lease entirely or own? Have you questioned the cleaning company? Do they have a protocol? Is it published? Is it something that you can communicate to your employees with confidence that it's being done every day? Employers may also have a fear themselves, and they may say, you know, we're not ready yet, and so we're not ready to call people back. Talent attraction and talent retention are two areas where, if you think about it, you expand your talent pool tremendously if you, instead of hiring from your zip code, you're going to hire from your time zone, and that employees can work anywhere, and so therefore you can recruit from anywhere. If you're drawing talent from competitors with more rigid policies, this may be an opportunity. On the flip side, some employees may hear the mandate to return to work in the office environment or in the facility and say, you know what, I'm just not comfortable. I'm going to look for other opportunities. And they may have success with that. And some companies may begin to market that as a competitive advantage for drawing and retaining talent. Okay, there's an organization in New York City called Conference Board. Some of you may be familiar with it. They are a think tank organization, and they publish research from time to time, and they'll publish survey results and things like that. So the top 5 most significant organizational changes, according to the Conference Board survey: remote work, which we just talked about, and doing that longer term; disaster recovery planning. And I would stop here for a minute and just say, how many of us before March had some type of disaster recovery plan in place? How many of us had even thought about a pandemic impacting how and where our employees work, or the safety and health of our workforce? It's probably something that should be on or near the top of your list. Workplace health and safety, as I said before, in some environments it was just an afterthought, and now it really needs to be top of mind for all of us. And then flexibility. Just like with anything, flexibility is an option for those who have a business model that can adapt to it. But showing that flexibility now is going to be important going forward in terms of attracting and retaining talent. Employee engagement is one of the areas that is, I think, most written about right now and most talked about because of the remote nature of some of your employees and how you're taking a gauge, not just on what they're doing, but how they're doing it and whether the home work environment is conducive to staying engaged throughout the day. Again, this is an area of big concern. It may be the kind of thing where some employers just never were quite tuned into it, maybe made assumptions about the type of work that their employees do is what keeps them engaged, and people like what they do, they like their jobs. So as a leader, I really don't need to check in on them all that much. I think that kind of mindset is about to change in a pretty big way. Okay, another group that I looked into is the Manpower Group, and they do surveys from time to time, and in this one, they took a group of over 8,000 employees and leaders, 1,000 of those being in the U.S., and they did sort of a pulse survey on how that hybrid or flexible working environment is going. And so they found the following, that traditional 9-to-5 workday is over. You can see in that graphic, it's 43%, but that's a pretty significant percentage. Leaders must learn how to prioritize employees' mental well-being. And this may not have been something that was really in focus before, but it's something that we need to be more mindful of as leaders going forward. Digital upskilling, and what I take away from this is that once you enter the virtual world, I would say that probably a lot of us that try to deploy remote work environments ran into some speed bumps along the way because technology was just not up for the challenge. Um, in addition, making sure that your workforce has the right skills to maximize the effectiveness of technology and make it more efficient and not something that frustrates them. And obviously, any kind of training and development that goes along with that is going to be key. And then, as we said before, trust is really the foundation in a remote working environment. Another survey was a group called Engine Insights. And Engine Insights was retained by a company called Smartsheet. And the Smartsheet CEO, I think, makes a very good point. And to be effective, people need to stay deeply connected to their work and the work of their teams. They also need the context, structure, tracking, and visibility into their work. And it's not just about simply connecting people and teams through video-based technology. I think a very kind of poignant point that he makes about his workplace. And so they went out and said, well, we ought to do a survey. And so they retained Engine Insights to do it. And here are some of the key findings. So one of the most, I think, insightful things about their survey is what happened with the Gen Z and millennial group that was counterintuitive to what you might think. You might think that those groups would adapt more quickly to a technology-driven environment, remote work from home arrangements. They're having difficulty as these metrics show. They also feel less connected. 82% and 81% respectively of Gen Z and millennials. And then overall, there's 60% feel less informed about what's going on within their company, 74% and 66% respectively of Gen Z and millennials, while the more seasoned workers, 53% of Gen X and 50% of baby boomers feel the same. So again, a little bit, not so intuitive as far as what I would see. And so here are some of the other things, and this probably doesn't surprise anyone, that video calls impede productivity. You can see the numbers there, and then they're comparatively lower for Gen X and baby boomers, who appear to be able to adapt to working around the video calls more so than Gen Z and millennials. Then you have 48 and 46% respectively of Gen Z and millennials saying colleague communication has been difficult. And then again, a lower percentage for the Gen X and boomer group. And then surprisingly, younger generations are sticking to traditional platforms for getting work done. The other survey that I looked into, and we'll go through this one pretty quickly, but it's Energage, and Energage is a local company based out of Exton, Pennsylvania. What they are known for is the top workplaces survey. And the top workplaces survey has been going on for many years. It's virtually the same group, although the group I would guess grows over time. It's the same question set every year. And what they did is they took in a pre-COVID survey of about 1,700 organizations, they asked them this question set, and then once the COVID pandemic hit, once the pandemic hit, they went back out and got 700 companies to participate again. And so their results are in terms of positive or negative versus the prior results. And so when you look at it, they have this concept called clued-in employees in their surveys. And the clued-in employees typically are the ones they want to hear from to see whether they feel more positively or more negatively. These are more engaged employees to begin with. So that's up 22%. They feel more informed. And it's up 17% in terms of the leaders saying that senior managers understand what's really happening. Up 16% with interdepartmental cooperation. better cooperation now than there was before. 15% more appreciation, appreciated more now than before. And then oddly enough, fair pay is something that employees feel more satisfied with. That's up 13% from pre-COVID-19 levels. I thought this was interesting because, again, it's the same survey, and they ran it before and they ran it after, and this would point to some slightly different results than what we saw from the prior survey. And here are the type of questions that the survey has, which can give you an idea of the credibility of the survey. Genuinely appreciated, part of something meaningful, feel well informed about important decisions, senior managers understand what's really going on, my manager makes it easier for me to do my job well, there's good interdepartmental cooperation, and my manager cares about my concerns. What I also did was I got a quote from the CEO, Eric Rubino, about the results and what were his thoughts. Overall, Energage, their quote, you can see it at the top right. Top workplaces, organizations always incorporating employee feedback into their strategies, and now more than ever, they're seeing that approach pay great dividends. So Eric says that right in April and May, some of their key indicators were up and positive. Retention, motivation, and referral. Would you refer somebody to work at this company? And then in June, there was a drop, and the drop was down 7%. And his sense is that reality was starting to sink in, that things weren't going to go back to normal, and return to the office a lot less clear cut than many had hoped. And then in July, it bounced back. Not quite as much as they thought it would. The reality of work from home, and then some of the businesses were not doing very well. There were layoffs, things like that, but it was still up 13% from the pre-pandemic levels. So I like this survey. I think it has a lot of credibility. The base that it draws from is large, and it also, again, asks the same questions pre and post-COVID. So I would give a lot of credibility to this, and it generally points to a positive direction. Okay, so some of the takeaways. I think that these three concepts are going to be very, very important: communication, connection, and culture. And as far as communication goes, the one-on-one, there's really nothing that replaces that. And it's not like, my employees or any of your employees want their manager to be calling them all the time to talk to them, but it is important in terms of engaging your employees and boosting their morale. That direct one-on-one communication, it's really critical, and I'm trying to incorporate it into more of my style. I would also say consider increasing the frequency of any prior one-on-ones that you had. Increase that cadence. Get that going a little more frequently, and it doesn't always have to be about business. Part of that conversation can be about how they're doing, since you're not seeing them in the office. And then don't assume that trickle down, sort of socially circulated information is going to get out there. The water cooler or the break room conversations, they're just, if you're in a work from home or remote working environment, obviously that's not going to happen. Now, if you've deployed some technology like Skype or Teams, and people can chat live, that can help tremendously. But that's not in every office or work environment, and it's not even an opportunity in some of the workplaces where employees are really more on the ground. So be proactive. As far as connection goes, it's slightly different in my mind than communication. The home environment, and my background is employment law. I am an attorney, but I don't practice law for Univest. It's important to remember. But I have a substantial background in employee relations and some of the things related to policy where you have to be careful and you don't want to overstep. The home environment was something that, when you think about it, it may have been previously out of bounds. But now you're asking about potential issues that are relevant to their work because they are working from home. And so how are they managing balance between work and family? How's that going? Also, has their workday expanded? Do they need your help or just your understanding? Are they having trouble managing their time? And is that something that you could help them with as a manager? It's very important to understand, particularly given this, the end of the traditional 9-to-5 workday, if we believe that, that workdays are going to expand, particularly if a desk or the computer that's used for work is in line of sight all the time. If it's part of your den or family room and it's there, you may be thinking about work perhaps more than you should. That could get into burnout, could get into lack of engagement, and I would say along with that, the opportunity to connect with people after hours because they're working late. Me personally, I'm going to be careful about that. But anyway, so the other thing that there are some surveys that are going on right now. The Centers for Disease Control, in particular, has a pulse survey that they do regularly. I think every 2 weeks it's updated, and you can go on the cdc.gov site and see some of these results. But they're taking the pulse of U.S. citizens on how they're feeling, particularly the pandemic. Are they feeling isolated, disengaged? Are they, suffering from some level of depression? There's a lot of privacy issues around this that you have to be very, very careful with, and you don't want to set yourself up for knowing too much information. But certainly, in terms of their overall well-being, how are they? Just that question. How are you doing? And are there indicators that they might be less engaged? These are things that didn't really come to the forefront when people were in your line of sight and they were working just down the hall, but they may be more relevant now given the remote environment. Then I would say in terms of culture, I think this stuff has to be real. Sure, you can improve communication channels. You can even make stronger connections, but if it's not pervasive in the culture, employees may not believe it, or it might end up being inconsistent and unsustainable. But if you build that trusting culture, you do that through sincere communication and connection. You lead by listening. The other thing that's interesting is when you think about employees that may be in front of you and they're talking to you in a one-on-one across the desk versus communicating remotely, there may be issues with them using a camera. They may not like to turn their camera on. They may feel insecure about communicating in the remote virtual way. It may actually tilt some of their conversation or make them clam up. You really, I think, have to listen more now than you did in the past to what employers are saying and what aren't they saying, even sometimes more importantly. This is a big one. There are a couple of companies, and Best Buy being one of them. I think it's got to be almost 10 years ago now that their corporate employees were measured by results and not their activity, and therefore their work days could be flexible. They might come in late some days they might come in early, but as long as they were getting their work done, their management was trained to measure those results and to do that diligently. And it wasn't so much about, hey, Joe's not at his desk right now, where is he? Hey, Joe might be out for a run, who knows? That wasn't the point, and the point was measuring results. It's, in a remote work environment, this is going to be absolutely key. And we talked about this lowering the expectations of 9 to 5, technology-driven work environment. I think we're going to implement Microsoft Teams relatively soon. I'm looking forward to that very much, and I think it's going to really help our teams, as the name suggests, communicate more effectively. A caring culture with an emphasis on well-being support is key. If any of you are in a position to implement, say, an EAP, employee assistance program, that may be something you want to think about as far as making sure there's a confidential and private way that employees can share some of their concerns and some of their, not feeling so well kinds of comments back to a trusted and independent source. Okay, I think we're prepared right now to do a little pulse survey, and here it is. So here are the questions, and all these are anonymous. We're going to count the responses, but we're not going to talk about who the response is from. There's no way of identifying that. So please, if you could respond to these questions, and has your company surveyed your employees since the COVID-19 pandemic began for their feedback on any work-related topic? So let's take a minute here and respond, and we'll see what those answers look like. Okay, I think we're coming down to the end of our time here, and I think the results will display. There we go. Okay, so it looks like we've got about a third of it's primarily informal, not using a formal survey, but informally polling their employees on work-related topics. Looks like a close second is that there are several that conducted a formal survey. And then I guess right behind that, companies that have not surveyed their employees and don't have the intent to do so. So thank you everyone who submitted a response there. That's very interesting. Looks like informal surveying is going to be the order of the day. I would just encourage any company out there, anyone who's out there that's in any kind of position to start to poll your employees. I think it would be valuable feedback before you might mandate a return to work. Okay, the litigation landscape. This is interesting. This is an Atlanta-based firm, Fisher Phillips, and to date, there have been a total of 663 COVID-19 related lawsuits. And remote work and issue conflicts or leave conflicts has been the #1 source of litigation. I've highlighted the overall numbers for Pennsylvania and New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the top states in the country right now. They have, somewhere it looks like around 12% of the litigation. Pennsylvania, somewhere down near a third of that. But remote work and leave conflicts, this would be relevant to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the extended leave and emergency leave provisions under that act, and where employees would have felt like they had conflicts in working, and the employer and the employee didn't see eye to eye, and the employee brought a suit. The next one is a little more detail on the remote work and leave conflicts. You can see there are 170 of them out of that 663. New Jersey with 27 and Pennsylvania with 10. Next one is employment discrimination cases. And these would relate more to employees who possibly were called back and may have felt that they were at risk and were discriminated against, in terms of their ability to take more leave than other, perhaps non-protected class individuals. Close behind that is retaliation and whistleblower claims, and this is actually the fastest growing segment of litigation right now related to COVID-19. Pennsylvania is not very active in this right now. New Jersey is fairly active with about between 15 and 20% of all the cases. And this is coming from a number of areas. One of them is related to safety and health, and employees being called back, taking a look around and saying, I'm not too comfortable with this, and I don't think my employer is doing what they're supposed to do under the CDC or OSHA guidelines. Some of us may not be all that tuned into OSHA in the past. There's a relatively low threshold of number of employees, 10, I believe is the number. So if you have more than 10 employees, OSHA kicks in. But even if you don't, you might want to take a look at the OSHA guidelines, and it's the kind of thing where it could prevent complaints in the future. You wouldn't be subject to an audit, but you'd certainly have tighter policies and procedures in place in the workplace if you did. Okay, so let's go through these quickly because I think we're running a little behind here. So here are the ways to really, I think, minimize the liability and manage risk. Wage and hour liability could be a very explosive area because if you think about it, if you don't have the technology to monitor the hours that your employees are keeping while they're working remotely, and you're asking them to do this, and it's a trust thing, that's great. But if it's not well documented and there's a discrepancy, it's the kind of thing that can really get you in trouble in terms of litigation, where an employee over a period of time finally looks at their hours and says, hey, wait a minute, I think I worked more than 40 in these weeks and I didn't get any overtime. Very difficult and challenging to do in a remote setting. There are definitely obligations you want to take a look at, and the DOL.gov site is a good site. They have some sections on COVID-19, particularly for small employers, FAQs and guidelines, and I would encourage you to go out and take a look at that. You know, the ADA is something that is very relevant, and it's something that sometimes is overshadowed by family medical leave, but it's very real, and it's the source of a lot of litigation in the U.S. right now. And ADA will become a bigger potential risk as some of the return to work policies start to take effect. And then make sure that when you return people to work, you have some level of documentation, and you don't just say, hey, let's take Joe back. He's a good guy. And let's take Mary back over here. We love Mary. We really missed her around the office. And meanwhile, these are two people that they're great. You know, they're by all accounts, you're going to be better off to return Joe and Mary to the workplace. But in terms of who you might have excluded and who's still on furlough that is in a protected class, that could be the source of a claim. So just be very careful about documenting legitimate business rationale. Okay, I'm going to give up the camera and the mic to Greg Blemlek, who's going to talk about some employee benefit trends.
Hello, everyone. I am happy to jump in for a couple minutes. Jim asked me to kind of dip in here and talk about employee benefit trends as it relates to what Jim has been talking about. And as I listen to Jim, and I've heard this before, but it astounds me at how connected what Jim talked about is prevalent in the employee benefits space. I will keep my remarks shorter than expected so that we can honor our commitment to the roughly hour that we have for this webinar and get you guys going. So I will focus specifically on a point that Jim made around the importance of communicating and connecting and relying on your company culture. In fact, some of you may know, and if you don't, you can get access after the fact, that employee benefits side of Univest has done hosted 3 webinars to this point throughout the pandemic. Hard to believe we're 6 months in, and those webinars were around some of the areas Jim discussed. The first one was around the importance of an EAP program and how you can connect with your employees very specifically in a way that maybe you had not in the past. Historically, EAPs were not that utilized in the workplace. They certainly, the statistics and surveys around that now have skyrocketed as employees' mental health has become much more of an issue as they try to balance and navigate working from home. A lot of types of jobs that really are more suited to working in an office or at a location, but no one expected to be where we are on back on March 12th. I would also say that the second webinar we did was around culture, the importance of a culture, and I'll hit on that as I tie the communication and connection and culture together. But the companies that have a strong culture and the clients we know and work with that have a strong culture are best positioned to remain in this pandemic for the length of time that we will. And then also as we exit the pandemic and we enter a new world, a new normal, if you will, of how we deliver communication to employees, how we deal with benefit trends. The third webinar that we did was on, in fact, benefit trends, both in the short term, and the short term looked at the fact that, for 6 months, utilization has been epically down, because obviously hospitals and surgical centers were dealing with, and other places of help were dealing with COVID, and those types of illnesses, and people are putting off elective procedures. The stats around that are staggering, and hopefully people will go back and have that work and those procedures done post pandemic as soon as possible. And those 3 webinars really are tied into this webinar today, and again, those are available. So what I would quickly say is Jim talked a lot about surveys and the importance of those surveys and what those surveys are telling us pre-pandemic and within the pandemic, and then post, obviously. The communication, the connection, and the culture is important. I'll give you a couple of things that we're seeing specifically with our clients and our prospective clients as we talk to people every day in the employee benefits practice. For example, I'll look down and I'll tell you that from a communication perspective, we're hearing a lot about how companies are communicating to their employees these virtual open enrollment. As you know, we're about to enter the 4th quarter. A lot of companies, a lot of you on this webinar today will be renewing your employee benefits plans on January 1st. Maybe some before that, maybe some after, but you'll be doing that for the first time, and not by choice, obviously, in a remote type of a setting. You may have 20, 30, 50, 100 people on a Zoom meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting, and we will be delivering open enrollment materials along with the carriers that you've selected and we've selected with you, all remotely for the first time, and we're hoping that goes smoothly. But there's not a lot of precedent for that for companies that haven't done it in the past, so that you have to be really good at communication. Workflow changes. I can tell you just at Univest, we normally have 60 or 70 people in our location here. We have on average 10 to 15 at most. The workflow is different, right? So it's not just working from home or not working from home. It's once you are working remotely or not, how does the workflow change? In my job, I go out onto the floor and I talk a lot with people and we talk about strategy for our clients. Well, I can't do that now. The majority of the folks that on the teams are working remotely, so I have to be intentional about connecting with people, and people have to be intentional about connecting with each other. And so we're dealing with a lot of companies that are asking us questions around that. Updated leave policies. Well, we could spend 2 hours. We won't today. We could do a webinar alone just on how leave policies have been expanded and changed, altered, potentially indefinitely by the pandemic and by the requests of employees. Because the reality is all the things that we talk about stem from the concept of employees being your most important asset, right? We say that all the time. And never has that statement been put to the test like it has under this current pandemic. Real quick to kind of wrap this up, when you talk about connection and connecting with employees, and Jim talked about this too, connecting through an EAP program, we talked about that, the importance of that. Companies are implementing what they call mindfulness programs. Mindfulness programs meaning I got to get out to my people remotely. So I want to offer virtual fitness classes, virtual financial wellness classes and sessions, and stay connected with people. One of the cooler things I've seen, and we've seen on the employee benefits side, is companies intentionally assigning employees buddies. So as people work from home and that sense of isolation grows, and they don't feel like that they have a cure for it, the buddy system, being connected to one or two employees in their company formally by their employer, has allowed pods of people, even just two people, to talk about, hey, what is your experience? It may be people that have like ages children at home. How are you handling working from home and also educating from home, which is a big topic this fall, right? These are the issues that we are dealing with every day on the employee benefits side, and we are here from an employee benefits perspective and a team to help you through those. If you need help in those areas and other areas like you see on the screen, we are happy to roll our sleeves up and get into that. So kind of a lot of information in a short period of time. I apologize for that, but I want to try to keep us on track here and turn it back over to Jim. And get to the next segment of what we're doing. Thank you, though, for everybody's patience today.
Hey, Greg, thank you very much. Really nice tie into some of the topics that we were covering earlier. And, I do think that taking that pulse, EAP, that kind of thing, particularly some of the things we mentioned about extended leave and just general wellness. So thanks again, appreciate it. We're going to move on to Reggie now in terms of viability of COVID-19 related workers' comp claims. Reggie, are you out there?
I am, Jim. Thank you. So thank you everyone for your patience so far. I'm going to move even faster through this information, but the saving grace is if you are available on October the 14th, we're going to do a much deeper dive into the business implications as far as from an insurance standpoint of COVID-19. So, Jim, next slide, if you don't mind. So for this presentation, we'll talk about workers' compensation insurance. So first things first, have to define it. For those of you who haven't seen the textbook definition, workers' compensation is the system by which no-fault statutory benefits prescribed in state law are provided by an employer to an employee or their family due to a job-related injury, including death, resulting from an accident or occupational disease. So one of the main questions we have been receiving throughout the pandemic, but also more recently, as more companies are trying to rotate employees back onto their physical locations, are concerns around if an employee does get COVID-19 and they allege that they acquired the illness from the place of employment, how is workers' compensation going to treat that? So historically, community spread illnesses like the cold and the flu are generally not covered by workers' compensation. The issue is the onus is on the employee to prove that they actually acquired the illness from the place of employment. With community spread illnesses, it's nearly impossible to do that. I can't prove that Jane coughed and the droplets hit my desk and I acquired the disease that way. So workers' compensation carriers are generally not going to respond with coverage historically based off of community spread illnesses. Just so everyone's aware, there's two main coverage categories in the state of Pennsylvania where a workers' compensation claim can be brought. Injury. For injury, think more acute, think more immediate things. I cut my hand, I stubbed my toe, I hurt my back lifting something. And then there's also occupational disease. This is more long-term injuries that arise from environmental issues. Folks that work in an office, carpal tunnel syndrome. You may take 30 years for you to get symptoms of carpal tunnel. Folks working around carcinogenic material, paint booths, paint sprayers, anything like that. So these generally take longer to come to fruition than more of those acute, immediate type injuries. The thing I want everyone to keep an eye on, if possible, is a House bill that's out there right now, PA House Bill 2396. And what this is looking to do is in the state of PA, it's looking to grant a presumption for employees of life-sustaining businesses, that's in parentheses, in quotations, because they are defined in the bill, if these employees contract COVID-19 or any other infectious diseases during a disaster emergency. This is not been settled on yet. I don't believe it's going to pass in its current form. I think there's more negotiations that need to happen. But what this will essentially do is that issue I talked about with community spread illnesses and having the employee prove that they received COVID-19 or any other infectious disease at the location of employment. This bill would eliminate that requirement. It would take the onus away. So I'll give you an example of how it could potentially apply in its current form. Life-sustaining business, the easiest example I can use are first responders. So in today's world, a first responder, they contract COVID-19, they're going to have to prove that they contracted that from their place of employment. With this bill, if this bill passes, they're going to say, okay, was the disaster emergency declared? The answer is yes. Governor Wolf did that back in March. Are they working for a life-sustaining business as defined by the statute? In its current form, those folks would be a life-sustaining business. Those individuals would not need to prove that they actually got sick from work. The statute's going to assume that they got sick from work, and they would be able to go back to your workers' compensation policy for medical benefits coverage only. That's very unique in the state of Pennsylvania. There's no other statute, there's no other bifurcation of medical benefits coverage and wage loss benefits coverage. The bill as is right now does have that split out. My guess is the legislators are looking for the wage loss benefits to be kicked over to unemployment insurance. So the next slide is going to deal with some of the disruptions as far as from your employment statuses. So we all know that we have had major disruptions on this side. So what is the best way to handle these? How are the workers' compensation carriers going to be handling these? My best advice, and it's not too late for this, is document any changes that you have had in any of your employment statuses for any of your employees. Names, dates, duties, payroll, document it all. Remember, workers' compensation policies are auditable, so either the insurance carrier or the state, depending on who you write it through, is going to want to verify. They're going to want to true up on what they're rating the policy based off of, the class codes, the payrolls, and then what actually did take place during the policy term. So I have 4 bullet points here. These are a great starting point for your documentation. Any employees that have switched to a work from home arrangement, any employees that have been put on paid furlough, any employees that have been laid off or terminated. And finally, if you've had any business operation changes from your normal scope, you're going to want to also document those changes as well too. Even if it was just a temporary change in your operations, you absolutely want to document those changes, document the revenue changes, document expense changes. One of the most common we have seen is for our restaurant clients. They've had to temporarily hire drivers that during the shutdown, they didn't previously have any of those folks on staff. Now they've hired some in order to maintain their revenue stream and offer that as part of their operations, at least in a go-forward capacity. So, and just as a reminder, if you're interested, October 14th at 1 p.m. will be our next webinar. We're going to do a deeper dive not only into workers' compensation, but also into business income insurance and how that's changed and how that's been impacted by COVID-19. Thank you very much. Back to you, Jim.
Okay, Reggie, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And, you know, some of the aspects of the documentation requirements, again, I would encourage you to go out to osha.gov. They really do have some very practical documentation requirements for certain employers, but even if you're not subject to OSHA rules, documenting in the way that OSHA has required could help you with some of these situations that Reggie just spoke about. Okay, we're at the point now where if we had started at 1 and if we had not had some technical issues, I would be wrapping things up. Anyone who needs to leave, please go ahead. We appreciate you being here today. And again, please stay tuned for the next session in October. I'm going to go for about another 10 minutes, and if people can hang in there, I would greatly appreciate it. So let me get started without any delay. You know, there were some very prominent, I guess, bills and acts that were passed right after the COVID pandemic hit. And so you have the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That was very employee focused. Then you have CDC guidelines and OSHA guidelines, public and workplace safety. Then you had the CARES Act. This was more stimulus focused around small businesses. And then you had the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. These were loans, repayment forgiveness. Remember all these that came through? Then Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they have local rules that predominantly cover social engagement and commercial operations. And then finally, we have the HEROES Act, which is the one right now that's tied up in the Senate. There's a argument going on about primarily the amount of stimulus that will be provided. I think there's a $3 trillion versus a $1.2 trillion debate going on right now. I'm sure there are other things, but these are the things that were really put in place early on and what are sitting out there right now. The two major provisions under the Families First Act is one that you have the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. The employers with fewer than 500 employees and some public employers must provide paid sick leave of up to 80 hours or roughly 10 days to full-time employees who need to take leave for certain coronavirus-related reasons. The act also says that employees may be eligible for an additional 10 weeks of family leave paid at 2/3 of their regular wages. Now, there are statutory caps in each of these cases, but this is the basic provision. And the second one is caring for a child whose school or daycare is closed or whose child care provider is unavailable. What I would say here is that what you need to be careful about, and where the law, I'll share with you, the law was recently challenged in New York about approval for intermittent leave. Let's say that your child's school says we're going to go on a staggered school week, and your son or your daughter will be going on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And that creates that need for stay at home for the other 3 days. So it gets very complex, but basically that type of leave was challenged by the New York court as being overbearing, and that employees should not have to get this approval in advance. But the Department of Labor just came out with a clarification on that, and that upfront approval, as far as I know, was just published, I believe, yesterday. That approval is still required for intermittent. So you have this 10 weeks, and it's presumed that it's continuous, but if it ends up being part-time or intermittent, that's where it starts to get a little messy and requires those approvals up front. So initially the focus was around leaves of absence, COVID-19 and related employee illnesses, family illnesses, child care needs, emergency situations, COVID-19 related care of self and others, extension of paid leave and unemployment. Also extension of traditional leave due to COVID-19. Now the more recent focus is on reopening workplaces, safety, cleanliness standards, social distancing, and then still we have ongoing area of focus is general leave provisions, and that's still a concern as schools reassess or reverse their decisions to reopen. So the revised leave rules that just came out, they did reaffirm that leave may be taken only when work is actually available. So what the New York law challenged was, or the New York court, was to say it doesn't matter if work is available or not, this person's going on leave because of a COVID-19 related illness. And DOL said, nope, there's got to be underlying work available for that employee. They also reaffirmed that an employer's approval, as I said, is required for intermittent leave. And then they revised the definition of healthcare provider to basically the FMLA definition, which I won't go into other than to say they're employed to provide diagnostic services, preventive services, treatment services, or other integrated necessary services. Before, the definition of healthcare provider, which, by the way, does exclude some of those leave provisions, the paid leave provisions, that was a really, really broad definition that excluded a lot of people from what would otherwise be available to them. So then they also clarified that supporting leave documentation is required, and I don't know what this means yet, but it says as soon as possible. So that's apparently further clarification to come. They also clarified the inconsistency of when employees may be required to provide employees notice of their need to take expanded family and medical leave. This, again, I don't have a lot of information because it just came out, but I'd be happy to follow up with anybody who's interested. You can feel free to email me and I'll be happy to provide that additional information. So here are all these work guidelines, and I don't think we're going to have time to go through all these, but again, cdc.gov, and there is actually an article called Prepare Your Small Business and Employees for the Effect of COVID-19. You can see it at the bottom left there, referenced. And these guidelines are really, really, I think, very practical. Some of them are obvious, but I'll go through them quickly. If you don't have a COVID-19 coordinator yet, you really do need to identify one. Someone who could take responsibility, even for what I said before about who's the cleaning company and what are they doing every day and how are we documenting it? How can we communicate that to employees that are coming back to the workplace to make them feel safer? Any policies that you have for leave, telework, compensation, particularly on wage and hour for non-exempt employees, I would encourage you to take a look at those policies. Essential positions. This is really, really important. One of the things that may have caused a lot of angst and grief and fear, frankly, when COVID-19 first occurred was an employer identifying essential positions at the last minute, and your employee being surprised to say, wow, I didn't realize that I have to go to work. So if a job description identifies the position in advance and is communicated up front to the person that says, hey, just so you know, if we have another pandemic again, your position is going to be essential and we're going to need you to be here. Prepare business continuity plans. We talked about that earlier. COVID hit, it was a big surprise. It's very tragic. It's cost a lot of businesses their livelihoods. Many have gone out of business. And who knows, maybe if there had been some continuity plan thought of early on, some of those businesses might have survived. Emergency communications plan, clearly communicate your response plans and expectations of what employees should expect as well as what you should expect of employees. And then here's another one that's really tough, and I honestly think it could be very, very difficult, but contact tracing and making sure that there's a way that an employee can pretty easily say, well, here's where I've been today, and here are the people that I've come in contact with over the last couple of days because I was just diagnosed. I think it's a tall order, but it's something that's being encouraged by the CDC. Okay. Here are the OSHA's updated guidance, and the reason that this is important is employers who are subject to OSHA are responsible for recording cases of COVID-19 if, and here are the three areas to watch out for, and what I'll share with you is their guidance around whether it is something that was work-related or not. And so when you look at this, it's likely work-related if several cases develop, workers who work closely together, and there's no other explanation. Again, here, no alternative explanation, but it was contracted shortly after lengthy close exposure, particularly customer or coworker confirmed case. Job duties include frequent close exposure to general public, locality with ongoing community transmission, no alternative explanation. So here again, likely work-related. It's likely to be not work-related if the employee is the only worker to contract COVID-19 in his or her vicinity. The job duties don't include frequent contact with the general public, regardless of the rate of community spread. So it could be all over the place, or it could hardly be anywhere, and an employee gets it, and they say, well, if it's the only one, and there's no one else in the vicinity of where that person works, it's probably not going to be work-related, and it's not going to trigger our OSHA requirement. Outside the workplace, close frequent association with a person who either has COVID-19, not a coworker, and exposes the employee during the period in which the person is likely infectious. Again, not likely to be work-related. And so they give you some guidelines in terms of determining, making the determination, and I'll just list them here. And it's the kind of thing where I think makes practical sense. Reasonable and good faith inquiry is conducted, and the employer in good faith can't determine if more likely than not the exposure in the workplace played a causal role. The employer does not need to record that COVID-19 illness. Okay? So those are just some of the updates compliance-wise that I felt were relevant and thought would be helpful for us today. I'm just going to go now into just a few closing thoughts. I'm not sure if we had questions posted, but if we have, certainly, and anyone wants to stay on, I can either do that now or I can take those questions and respond to the folks that have participated. So in closing, I would say that based on the survey data that I found, even though some of it's not completely consistent, the one theme that I found is that employers have to develop cultures of trust when there's remote workers. They have to lower their expectations with regard to the 9-to-5 workday. They also have to improve upon their communication, not just in terms of the volume of communication, but in terms of the sincerity of it and how it connects with the workers and the workforce generally. Employers have to be more attuned to employees' well-being. As Greg shared, that may be through an EAP, it may be through some of these well-being type of programs that he outlined. But however you do it, being more tuned in to your workplace, your workers rather, your employees, and how they're doing, just genuinely, how are they doing? How are things going? How are they doing working from home, balancing work and life? Is there anything they want to share with you? Maybe they don't, and maybe they just want to share it with the EAP provider. That's okay. If you're not planning on taking the pulse of your employees before you call them back to work, I would strongly suggest that you reconsider and think about any type of mandate that you might put out there and the fear factor that's still out there, and employees being very, very unsettled about returning to work. As it goes with the communication, anything and everything you can do to make sure that your employees feel safe and they feel like they're returning to a healthy environment where there is someone like a COVID-19 coordinator who's responsible for maintaining the safety and health of the workforce. That's it in terms of my closing thoughts. I do want to thank everyone for joining today. And I really do apologize for the technical difficulties we had, but it was quickly corrected, and have really enjoyed doing the research and presenting to everyone today. So stay tuned for future updates and also for our October 14th session. We do have a couple of questions. If anyone wants to stay on, I'll see if I can address them. And let's see. Okay. If an employer did not follow COVID-19 guidelines for employers and COVID-specific contact, could an employee class action suit be filed with the employer? This could be a legal question. So yeah, it's a legal question, but one of the things that I would say that I found, particularly on that Fisher Phillips site, is that class actions have been relatively few. And the ones that have developed have been around wrongful death, where, and in fact, I don't even know if they've been certified as a class yet, but where there have been, say, warehouse situations, Safeway stores is one of them. Again, I'm not sure if that's class action, but certainly yes, if there's a group of employees that become sick by the workplace and they don't have a remedy under workers' compensation, they may look to litigation and they may look to group together and certify a class and bring that against the employer. So yes, I would think that's something they could do. Is it also important to maintain time logs documenting the work performed from home? Again, is it important to maintain time logs documenting work performed from home? If you have non-exempt employees working from home, I would say yes, it's a very practical requirement to maintain some type of time log so that they are recording their time and they're reporting it for payroll purposes. However, I would be very cautious about maintaining time logs for exempt employees, particularly exempt employees who may be sort of on the bubble between non-exempt and exempt. These would be employees who have no supervisory experience or responsibilities and are sort of lower on the pay scale, lower in a pay grade, very, very close in pay and in grade to non-exempt positions. You might have an analyst versus a specialist, and one is exempt and the other is not exempt. And you ask that exempt employee to start tracking their time, eventually they may start thinking that they are, in fact, non-exempt and should be getting overtime for the extra hours. So I'd be very cautious about that and limit that to those that are non-exempt. Can anyone comment as to whether employers should be or are obligated to address ergonomics and injury prevention related to technology used in a work from home environment like they would typically do in the actual office space? You know, I'm actually going to defer to our next session on that one because I would think that it would be addressed under some longer term injury in a workers' comp scenario. Typically, workers' comp is the sole remedy for employees typically in Pennsylvania. But you can imagine if the ergonomics are not evaluated and someone has a horrible setup at home and then later they're injured, say it's carpal tunnel or something else, maybe it's their neck or their back and they need therapy, and you did nothing to try to mitigate that, it's a really fine line because you're not responsible for buying them their furniture at home. But then again, if they are not practicing what I would call safe working procedures, you might have some liability down the road. But again, I would be very cautious about that, and I would defer to Reggie and his team as we talk about workers' comp as one of the business insurance implications on the 14th. But those are the three questions that we got. Sorry, losing my voice a little. But I do appreciate those questions. I hope I was helpful in answering them. I think if there's nothing else at this point, I'm going to close things out and formally thank everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate it and hope to see you at our next session. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.